All right, I hope this is finding you guys well. Sorry I didn't podcast as much this week. Trying something new here with YouTube Live, see if it actually works. Um, but you guys have had a couple of days to work on your pandemic or epidemic Google Slides. So far, the ones that I have looked at, they are pretty good. I kind of wanted you to stay away from the bubonic plague, seeing that we're talking about it. But it's all right. I'll let you go with it as long as you're not using what we're going through now. That'll be something that could possibly be in the future for future seventh graders. Um, we've looked at feudalism and the manor system. I've talked to a couple of students, just like through Google Meets, one on one to work on some work with them, and I described the feudal system as being like the national government. The feudal aspect, like the king would be the president of the United States. When you look at this, so like the king, the president overlooks the entirety of the country. The manor system would end up being like Governor DeWine of Ohio. He looks over just Ohio, so it's a smaller snippet and smaller aspect, like geographically. So that's why, like, there was this one question on your on your packet that asked if why was it like a decentralized government? Well, it's like a decentralized government because you really don't see or talk to um, or around uh, the president. You might, you see him on TV, but he's not someone that you could possibly run into when you're walking the streets. Governor DeWine, though, that's one of the things that, like, you could go to Columbus and more than likely see him. I mean, in my time, I have actually seen and talked to governors. Um, so you have this like sense of in the manor system that that castle, that manor house, and that vassal, that lord that's leading that manor house, is more like Governor DeWine because that person is going to make the decision that's going to directly affect you right away. Um, Now, like the king would have an overseeing, or like the president would have an overseeing of what those governors are doing. Which, when you get to be a junior, you'll learn about federalism, and that's a huge thing that the country has. And for time frames, we would look at federalism as becoming weaker, meaning that states were and the power that a state has become weaker. But what you really see with what's going on now, and how states are working, and how like DeWine and even the governor of California, a few of these governors really led the charge on doing something about this pandemic before the national government even thought about doing anything. So you have this aspect of federalism at this moment, and it kind of correlates with the manor system and feudalism at the same time. So again, like I always tell you guys might think history is irrelevant because it's in the past, but here we are dealing with a lot of the government aspects today that we have that we had way back in the medieval times. So it's the same thing. But we also talked about the plague. That was the big thing that we went over this last week and early beginning of this week, and it's why I gave you guys that the work that I had you guys do, this Google Slides that you were putting together. So you have like this this aspect with the plague where healthcare back then was really nothing. I've told you guys even in class before we left, they used like bloodletting, where they would just basically slit their wrists or an area of their body and bleed out almost. And a lot of times it led to death just because of becoming anemic, not having enough blood in you. They also used leeches. They used like frogs, like crushed up frogs or something like that. They had like some crazy thought processes to how to try to see how to stop the bubonic plague. And here's the interesting thing that I've been reading about. We're bringing back kind of old processes of trying to work with and find a way to slow the effects of COVID-19. And what they're doing is they're actually taking people, and this is an old process that was used a long, like 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago. They're taking blood out of people who have recovered from COVID-19 and spinning it, getting the plasma out of it, and then injecting that plasma into people who currently have it, in hopes that the plasma has antibodies in it, and it will help fight the infection and the virus that's in the bodies of these people that are in critical care units or intensive care units. And this is, it's old. This was used during the 1918 Spanish flu. And you really kind of see this if you guys would have had listened, if you listened to the podcast. I talked about how there's a group of people who looked at the people who actually lived through the bubonic plague. They got it, they lived through it, and they were like, why in the world, everybody, 75% of people get this, die, but you lived. How and why? It's just at that point in time we weren't, I wouldn't say humans weren't smart enough, they just weren't advanced enough to understand that the body builds up antibodies and those types of things, and we can spin the blood down to get this plasma and stuff like that. The thought process was there, like, why are they living through? But the thing is that we just didn't have we didn't have the technology at that point, that advancement aspect. We talked about how the bubonic plague changed the way people lived, and we really can relate that to probably to now. I mean, we still have the future of what this is doing to human beings, and the contagious aspect of this, how it's more contagious, or it's seen to be more contagious than the regular flu and other aspects. But we've seen through history, like you can even go back to the HIV and AIDS pandemic that happened in like the 80s, and it changed the way people lived. And the bubonic plague did the same exact thing. So we talked about a little bit where the bubonic plague forced people to actually live not in the rural aspects where these manor houses were, but now they were moving to cities because the cities needed them to work. They needed them in these early mills and shops and stuff like that, because remember, like 60% of Europe died from this. Like 30, I think it was like 30 to 60% is what we talked about. So you're needing people to work in areas, and if you have been if you had this and recovered, then you move to the city to find jobs. And it really took the manor system totally out of it, and the feudal system totally out of it, because these people weren't relying on a lord or a king anymore. They were needed now, and they kind of had this bargaining chip, where the fact of the matter is that they could look at the king and they could look at the manor lord and go, you need me, and we want more rights. so it changed the way people lived during that time, and we can really probably look at COVID-19 and the coronavirus we got going on now. That it can change the way we all live. Like, you might not hug people anymore for a while. You might not shake hands. You might see more people wearing masks for a while. We might even change the way class sizes are in school. Like, two of the seventh grade classes have like 22 people in them, 25 people in them, around there, and my room was totally packed. You might see where there can only be a certain amount of class sizes and or people in the class, because we have to keep a distance, especially if this shows up again. So it could easily change the way we live and the way we interact with people. Sharing a drink with somebody, like a water bottle, even a squirt bottle, something like that. You might not do that. Bag of chips, like, hey, here, take some chips out of my bag. You might think twice about that, because you don't know what that person has had. So this can change it too. It's obviously foreseeing the future at this moment. I mean, human beings might just go back to being what human beings were, and not even doing anything different. But I will say that I haven't been out of the house that much. I think it's been like 6 or 7 times, other than riding my bike. And when I'm out riding my bike, I see a lot more people outside than what I did before this, where people are, the bike trail is packed. I see people when I ride on the roads. I see people out in their front yards doing yard work, kids playing outside. We're not inside. I don't know about you guys, but I mean, we try to get our 2 daughters outside as much as possible instead of worrying about technology. So you might see this movement back to like when I was a kid, in the early 90s. We have this time frame of like, hey, get outside, play wiffle ball, play kickball, play basketball, play football, ride your bike, do all of this stuff, compared to what you guys are really right now. I'm not saying all of you, but a lot of you are more interested in video games and technology, TikTok, your phones, all that stuff. So it could change the way we live, and moving forward. So the next thing we're going to look at is on slide 58. So it's the last thing. We're almost done with this. We can get to the Renaissance for the rest of the school year. So we've got this 100 Years' War. Okay, it's a war between the French and the English. It's not the entirety of France, and it's not the entirety of England. It's like a couple of they call them houses. So like main people during that time, main feudalistic societies at that point in time, because you had different kings throughout areas. So if we go to this 100 Years' War, it was more than 100 years. Historians just call it the 100 Years' War. So it's between 1337 and 1453. England and France fought a series of battles for control over lands in France. It basically like contributed to the erosion of feudalism in 2 countries, in England and France, during this time. So you're really seeing this movement down of feudalism, and we're gonna leave feudalism and move on to the Renaissance thinking, and bringing back old thought processes, and trying to look at enlightened people from like Aristotle and Plato and all of those guys, and like bringing back the thought process of Greeks and Romans, and like getting away from this Dark Ages. The English won this war, but they kind of relied on they were outnumbered. Um, they won most of the early battles of the war, and it changes this landscape of feudalistic times. They were really different armies. Um, the French had a feudal army that relied on horses and mounted knights. And the French knights wore really heavy armor, so they couldn't move that well. Their weapons were swords and lances. They used crossbows, and you think about it, a crossbow is really only effective in a short range. You got maybe 50 yards, something like that. So the French had an old style army, and the English, in turn, they were made up of light armored knights. They're foot soldiers and archers armed with longbows, so they could shoot a lot farther. Some soldiers were recruited from the common people, and they were actually paid to fight. So instead of the French basically forcing someone to fight, and we've talked about this with the Greeks and Romans, and even the Persian empires, where you're paying someone to fight, they're probably going to try to stay alive. So the French did slowly chip away at the territory the English had won in the early years of the war. And in 1415, after a long truce, English King Henry V invaded France. This time, the English were actually met with a stronger resistance, and one reason was that the French were now using more modern tactics. They saw what the English were doing. So the English win a lot of these early battles and take over, and it looks like the war is over, and the English are just going to totally ransack France. But instead, the French actually learn from the English, and they modernized their military. So the French king started recruiting commoners, paying them with money collected from his taxes, just like the English did. So you have this this movement away from old style of fighting to a new style of fighting, and the French, it works for them. So we will leave with that, and then I will talk about the video on slide 60 on Monday. I've got nothing for you tomorrow. On Tuesday. I've got nothing for you tomorrow, and I've got nothing for you Monday. Please enjoy the weekend. Make sure you get your slides done. If you need help, please ask. Today at 1, I'm going to set up a Google Meet where we can, if you want to log in, you can log in, and we can talk about things that are being done assignment-wise. Maybe, even just how everybody's doing. And if you need help, you can ask those questions then. All right. So if I don't see you guys at 1, have a good weekend, and I will talk to you guys again on Tuesday.